Is NATO really the cause for Putin's Ukraine invasion? For as long as fighting has existed, people have gotten into conflicts to get the things they want from those deemed weaker than them. But there's only so far that a person or country can get away with openly bullying the weak before they're fully ostracized from the group or the world. This is why civilization and governments came up with extravagant excuses for their unacceptable behavior. You feel like taking that really nice piece of jewelry someone else has on? Take it and claim it belonged to your grandma. Feel like invading a whole slice of Eastern Europe yourself? Pretend you were forced to take it to defend yourself. As ridiculous as it seems, that second, pathetically piss-poor excuse is exactly what Russia is doing in 2022. And what's even sadder is that there are actual people dumb enough to believe in that BS. To most of the world, it's painfully obvious that Russia just takes a look at countries around them and decides, "Duh, they are weak, so I can take it as mine." Don't believe me? Just ask Chechnya, Georgia, and now Ukraine. Now, this aggression has always had one level of craphousery or another, with the flimsy excuses fluctuating in both audacity and conviction. Sometimes Russia manages to really convince a lot of the world that it needs to send in troops for some made-up noble reason. Although it is true, every country's own citizens are more likely to believe its own government BS than others. However, this is especially true in Russia, where the media spends most of its time in overdrive convincing Russians, and even a few crazy Westerners, that Russia is really the good guy that constantly stands up for itself and other supposed victims. With the invasion of Ukraine, though, Russia has come out with its most wild excuse yet. NATO's existence is a complex thing that many countries have a nuanced approach to discussing in their day-to-day foreign policy approaches. It's only natural that some aspects of huge organizations create mild bits of tension in different corners of the globe. In Russia's mind, though, NATO, led by the USA, which is literally a whole ocean away, is about to break through the creaky door like Johnny in The Shining and subjugate everyone in Russia to crazy Western rule. Oh, if we don't invade smaller neighbor immediately, then our whole land will be pillaged by organization of voluntary members who line up and pay expensive fee every year to maintain membership, and who only exist because we historically have habit of invading everyone around us. If you believe this excuse, then you really are a special kind of stupid. But the Kremlin has a lot of tools at its disposal to try to get people behind this crazy idea. The most effective weapons it wields in this regard are government announcements and the Russian media, which together try and mold the story day and night so that people think Russia is the scared little victim, despite having more landmass than any other country in the world. But what exactly is Russia making up to support this story? Well, this stage of tension between Russia and NATO goes back to the fall of the Soviet Union, when many states in Eastern Europe came into being and Russia stood on its own for the first time in decades. Now, this was a naturally volatile time as countries were being created and changed and taken apart. The opportunity was used to try and denuclearize that part of the world. The potential for the apocalypse during the Cold War was primarily made up of the big scary atomic button that each side was worried the other would press. So, naturally, when this opportunity for change came, a big effort was made to remove nuclear warheads from many of the recently liberated states. Ukraine, for example, is a vital example of a state that could have still had nuclear warheads to this day if it hadn't agreed to the pressure from NATO to disarm. Oh boy, does that look like a silly decision now, as there is no chance Russia would have been so bold if the country it was invading had access to nukes. So, the West pressured Ukraine to give up their nukes. But do you know who was allowed to keep their nuclear arsenal? That's right, Russia. In fact, Moscow is in control of more nukes than any other government in the world, and by some distance, too. Now, if NATO was hell-bent on turning Russia into rubble, how come they don't pressure them to denuclearize instead and make Ukraine do it? It's hardly the behavior of an expansionist or a bully to let your so-called victim keep the greatest collection of nuclear weapons ever assembled in the history of the world. Not only is Russia brilliantly equipped for violence, but they are also clearly more than happy to use it. The fact that NATO skipped the opportunity to reduce that weapon stockpile proves that Russia is not a victim at all, and perhaps should have been pressured far more than it was at the end of the Cold War. In fact, many of the countries of NATO that are closest to Russia have been demilitarizing since the end of the Cold War. Some aspects of NATO itself are even proud with how light on weapons part of the organization is. But thanks to Putin's invasion in Ukraine, the entirety of Europe will now be ramping up their military spending as a response to the Russian aggression. Oh, and one other thing. If NATO was to decide to heavily militarize Eastern Europe, they wouldn't need Ukraine to do so. Countries like Estonia, Latvia, and Turkey are already on Russia's doorstep, with Turkey in particular already having been a base of American nukes for years. It makes no sense for Putin to claim that Ukraine is some sort of final buffer zone between NATO and Russia. The two already border each other, and NATO has never launched an invasion from any of them. All of the countries to which NATO has supposedly encroached all joined the organization voluntarily and have never declared war on Russia since. Turkey has been a neighboring member for decades and still never shown any real possibility of even considering war on Russia. This point can really be hammered home if we imagine what would happen if Ukraine somehow joined NATO. If NATO were to place missiles in Sumy, a region in eastern Ukraine close to Russia's border, they would be around 520 kilometers from Russia's capital. Crimea, on the other hand, which has come under much more military pressure from Russia, is over 1,500 kilometers away from the Russian capital. Even within Ukraine, there seems to be little logic from Russia's aggression in actually creating this fictitious buffer zone. If Russia were really worried about the proximity of potential NATO firing points, then they would have turned their eyes to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, all of which could potentially host missiles that would be just a few hundred kilometers from Moscow and even closer to St. Petersburg. You only need to think about it for a few seconds to realize Russia's excuse just makes no sense at all. And even if they do successfully take hold of Ukraine, then they haven't really given themselves any extra breathing space at all. Instead, Ukraine can just be seen as part of Russia's long-standing tradition of invading its neighbors. Transnistria in the 1990s, Georgia in 2008, and Crimea in 2014 have all been directly victimized by Russia's wild aggression. At some point, excuses obviously become lies, and Russia is long past that point. It's not just the explicit invasions of those three areas which highlight this pattern, but also Moscow's heavy-handed approaches to Abkhazia and South Ossetia in the 1990s, and of course Donbass in Ukraine since 2014. So, for Russia to claim that NATO is the biggest threat in the region is an outright joke for the vast majority of countries that have to actually deal with Russia year to year. If Russia didn't have a huge history of attacking everyone around it, then it may be able to have launched a convincing propaganda effort that it was not the threat. But how can a country that has been repeatedly attacking others be the one that claims it's the one under threat of an imminent attack? Ukraine, Georgia, and others don't have time to worry about some potential NATO boogeyman of the future because they are already dealing with or have dealt with the erratic, violent regional power that Putin is driving. But whenever Russia is called out on these obvious holes in logic, they like to point back to the end of the Cold War when, supposedly, NATO promised not to expand even 1 inch to the east. Now, it may be possible that one drunken Western diplomat said this in a quiet room to another drunken Russian diplomat as one part of a huge negotiation between many countries and statesmen that lasted years. But we don't have any proof that that discussion ever happened. Even if a magical secret recording does turn up someday, that isn't the kind of thing that holds up in a court of international law. For those who don't understand the basics of international diplomatic relations, let me spell this out to you. Such agreements of utmost importance are discussed on many levels and require ratification by the highest members of government after months and possibly years of discussion. In other words, there would be so much evidence of paperwork that you would be able to easily identify it and point it out. Russia's defense here is that supposedly, 30 years ago, in one room, two people had a discussion that was never recorded, and so countries in Eastern Europe are now not allowed to voluntarily join organizations unless Russia gives them permission. Now, does that sound like complete BS to you? That's because it is. Even if in an alternative universe there had been a public discussion of such a possibility, then who is to say that it would have lasted for another 30 years? When you hear Russian defenders come out with this excuse, you know that they are really clutching at straws and never actually thought about this topic for more than 2 seconds. There has literally never been a document found that supports this promise that the Kremlin loves to hold on to. Do you honestly think an international agreement of that utmost importance would not be officially publicly ratified in a treaty or documentation somewhere? If you are that stupid, then I'm genuinely surprised how you've been able to survive falling down so many flights of stairs because your brain must be severely damaged. But amazingly, there are enough people that still believe this. So, Russia keeps on using this lie as the foundation of their accusation that NATO is an empire forever expanding east. But let's look at this and see if that holds any merit whatsoever. NATO has always had an open-door policy that means European and American nations can come and go as they wish and agree to protect one another when they are attacked. Oh, and did I forget to mention this? Every single NATO country signed up voluntarily. The process to join NATO isn't easy either. You need to pay a membership fee and then prove that you're worthy. This is required of every country that joins NATO. Every applicant is keen to do so, and that's why they jump through so many hoops to sign up. The process of joining Russia is not voluntary. Instead, they will invade your country through a special military operation and accuse your nation of being full of Nazis, even though your president is a literal Jew. How is the process of joining NATO and Russia anything alike? Now let's look at what the definition of an empire really means. It is the use of violent, expansionary tactics to add more land over which a state has control. Is it just me, or does that description perfectly describe what Russia does? Georgia didn't want to join Russia, so Russia invaded. Chechnya didn't want to join Russia, so Russia invaded. And Ukraine didn't want to join Russia, so Russia invaded. I don't know about you, but it seems as if Russia is the one that's the expansionist empire and clearly not NATO.